पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ बहुत सारे महाज खुले, कुछ हमने खुद खोले और काफी सारे हमारे खिलाफ खोले गए। आज के महाज। Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat S. I'm an independent journalist based here in New York City, reporting on Pakistan, India, and the rest of South Asia. Usually my shows are in Urdu, but at least a couple times a week, we try to expand to a broader audience because of the wider implications of what's happening in South Asia at large. This week, Indian External Affairs Minister, which most countries would call a foreign minister, S. Jaishankar, arrived in Washington to attend the Quad Summit. The Quad is Japan, India, the US, and Australia, usually talking about trade, security, and tech. But this time, the focus was on the meetings between Jaishankar and his counterpart, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, about the ongoing trade negotiations between India and the US. The two sides are trying to finalize the first phase of a deal before the 9th of July, which is just around the corner, when US President Trump's 90-day pause on his sweeping global tariffs is scheduled to end. Now, the trade talks are high stakes for any country, but especially high for India, whose economy has performed well but unevenly. India faces the prospect of a 26% US tariff at a time when this unevenness has been mixed up with other volatile factors when it comes to Washington, D.C. Some bumps have been seen in the relationship between especially the White House and Prime Minister Modi's South Bloc. There have been issues with Pakistan, with Operation Sindoor, the Americans not really coming out to support in a full-throated way India's confrontation with Pakistan. And then post-conflict, the American president's insistence that was him who was behind the intervention that eventually led to the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, something the Indians officially deny but are coming around to. Meanwhile, it's also very important to understand that Pakistan, India's arch rival, old nemesis, is also making ways into Washington, offering what we call the few C's: counterterrorism, critical minerals, crypto diplomacy, and now actually I just came up with this one, consultancy and chow in the cabinet room. The Pakistani de facto great leader, Field Marshal Asim Munir, having literally goat cheese gâteau and talking about critical minerals with Donald Trump just a couple of weeks ago. That just around the time the Indian premier was talking to Trump about, things that he needed to lay in order. So hyphenation between India and Pakistan is back. It's also expected at the trade talks level. The Americans have not officially announced that the Pakistani trade delegation, which was in Washington this week, has reached a deal with them. They are, from what I understand, they're wanting to announce that just around the same time the Americans and the Indians reach a deal. It's an interesting time, though I'm not sure if the Indians will appreciate being hyphenated once again as the White House announces a deal in South Asia. And to answer that with more nuance than I can ever muster is my wingman, the Kugelman, Michael Kugelman from Washington. Thank you for being with us once again on this Sunday fun day long weekend, man. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me. And I said this off camera. I think I could say it on camera now as well. That this is a nice way to round out what's somewhat of a down day, in the sense it's the end of a nice holiday weekend. But it's good to be spending some time here with you. So look forward to it. Now that I flattered you, I can assume that your questions to me will be very easy to respond to.
Well,
flattery.
Don't rest on your laurels. But you know what? You are what I would call an intellectually happy ending to a great weekend. I think the 4th of July weekend has developed as my favorite American weekend because of just usually the weather's perfect. It's one of those holidays when the weather's perfect and everything else sort of falls into place. But over the weekend, I know you were busy, and so was I, watching you being busy. Your Twitter feed has been picking up. You have made points about the Pakistani trade delegation, which was in the U.S. just last week, and they reached a nice, mellow little deal, stayed under the radar. But the Americans have yet to announce it. It's being played out well. you mentioned that partially in your brief, but from what I'm understanding, while the Indians and the Pakistanis, of course, different states, different economies, try to reach this deal with the US, why are the Americans insisting on announcing it together, as was stated in the Dawn story by our colleague Anwar Iqbal? And won't that really trigger a hissy fit in in South Bloc once again if that happens because the hyphenation is no good for India?
Yes, I mean, indeed. I mean, I would say this, that I suspect that there are many in Islamabad that would much prefer that the administration announce the deal with Pakistan first to show that, Pakistan was one of the first to get a deal done even before India. But yeah, there's been some speculation as to why the administration wants to wait. And, one of the theories is that Trump wants to essentially announce the Pakistani and the Indian deals at the same time, so that he could circle back to what he had been saying in previous days, that he helped end the conflict between Pakistan and India by basically telling them that we'll only do trade with you. He may, we know that with Trump, he's all about the big deal and the big announcement, and so he might feel that it's better to use the same announcement to announce deals with 5 or 10 or 15 different countries, because there are a number of other negotiations that, as I understand it, are coming close to closure, and that includes Bangladesh, as I understand. So
yeah, he likes everything to look like an NFL draft. I think the president loves a good pomp and dance. But
yes.
coming back in to the process, the bumps, as you call it, in this relationship, let's quickly rattle them off. Mike, you've talked about, while the broader trajectory is strategic between the Americans and the Indians, there have been bumps. Now, we talked about this last week, but you really listed down nicely. You talk about the pre-Sindoor problems, then you talk about the post-Sindoor problems, and now they're evolving into the trade side. Help me list it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but especially a lot of my Indian audiences say, "Oh, you tell your analysts what to say." So I'm not going to say anything, but lay it out for me, as well as our audiences. How bumpy has the relationship gotten since Trump 2.0 to this new Modi administration, which was elected
Yeah.
2 years ago?
Right. I mean, it started out well, or it looked to have started out well, in the sense that Modi was one of the first foreign leaders to be invited to meet with Trump since he returned to power. He was here in February, as you'll recall, and there was a joint statement, very long joint statement, that listed a bunch of things that the two sides would cooperate on. So things were looking quite good, not to mention the Indian government was making some pretty major concessions to the administration earlier on, such as agreeing to reduce tariffs and also taking back dozens of undocumented Indians in the US. And, these concessions are politically sensitive in India, as they would be in many countries. But New Delhi was willing to do that in order to reduce the likelihood of new tariffs, but also, I think, to signal its desire to make things work with this new unconventional administration.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, I think after Operation Sindoor, that's when things really started to go downhill. That's when Trump was very public in the U.S. role in the mediation, which is not something that India ever likes, because for India, third-party mediation is welcome during crises and conflicts, but it's not something that it wants broadcast to the world. So the fact that Trump announced it not once, but a number of times, did not go down well in New Delhi. Not to mention, President Trump renewed his offer to mediate an end to the Kashmir dispute, and of course, India's view is that there's nothing to discuss, there's no dispute. And then this sort of fell under the radar. I mentioned this in the brief. The U.S. suddenly announced a new travel advisory for India.
Yeah.
We're used to U.S. travel advisories for Pakistan,
Yeah.
but not for India. And it
For
described
crime and terrorism.
Yeah,
Terrorism. That's rare. And I don't remember the last time the Americans issued a travel advisory. It may have been around post Mumbai attacks, that back in 2008. It's been a while since that's happened. Why has this happened? It came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the actual advisory, I mean, it describes a number of concerns, as the U.S. puts it. I think that there might have also been some attention to concerns about threat to violence to women, but also it mentioned things like terrorism, and it was just rather great. I mean, none of this is necessarily new. I mean, India has struggled with these challenges for quite some time, but the fact that at this moment, when we're seeing these indications from Washington, it wants to work more closely with Pakistan, and that you're having all these things come up that have been upsetting India. It was actually, the travel advisory came out. It was published, I believe, the day before Modi and Trump had their 35-minute call, according to the Indian readout, when Modi reportedly, according to the Indian readout, was in great detail telling Trump, that there was no U.S. Intervention during the ceasefire. Anyway, so the
And Trump
timing
was
is all very interesting.
carefully listening, according to the Indian.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which he's not known to do. So that, but
Yeah.
maybe he did in this case. He and Modi do get along well.
Okay, so we're gonna. I want to end the whole arc on the trade deal, because that's fresh, that's hot, it's happening, and it's as we speak. But I do want to press on this a little more. The the travel advisory, and onwards from there. Jaishankar, who's developed a bit of a bad rep for having a chip on his shoulder, especially in Western capitals. But Jaishankar is in town, and he's been acting really nice. He was at this Newsweek conclave in right here in New York City, and he was talking about the follow-up to Sindoor. And again, he's been saying he's in the room. He was in the room. And I thought that was what his position is now, starting to look like remarkably more nuanced than that readout a couple of weeks ago. That readout a couple of weeks ago from PM Modi's office was, I talked to Trump. Trump carefully listened. I told Trump that trade or anything else was never mentioned, and there was no American intervention. But this time, Jaishankar has been a little nuanced about it and said, yeah, well, I was in the room when Vance called, and I was in the room when Rubio called, and the Pakistanis were threatening a vicious counterattack, and we attacked them. But he does defend his boss. He says, my boss was impervious to the Pakistani threats as relayed by the Americans. But still, what you have is the highest official in India's diplomatic regime finally saying that the boys in DC were calling. So how is this not the Indians finally playing nice and executing a U-turn of sorts? If not a U-turn, maybe a bit of a cul-de-sac. They're still going around their own a bit about, but it was us who directly dealt with the Pakistanis. However, they are finally admitting U.S. intervention. What's going on with this little give from India?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. It's almost like the Indian side is looking for the best way to present their argument in ways that would resonate with audiences here. I mean, as you know, there's been a fair degree of, maybe not skepticism, but a lack of a willing to fully agree with India on much of its positioning vis-a-vis this conflict, including the fact that no country other than Israel, along with states like Taiwan and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, fully backed India during the conflict and recognized India's position that they had counterterrorism imperatives and that they had a right to launch military action against Pakistan so long as they wanted to address this terrorism problem. You didn't get that. That's not the position that Washington and other Western capitals took. Their view is that you got to stop, you got to de-escalate because of nuclear risks. So in this particular case, I don't think that the Indian side has ever said that the U.S. was not involved at all. I mean, my understanding is that, and I think I've told you this before, my understanding is that the administration was in close contact with the Indian and the Pakistani sides to essentially urge them to look toward a ceasefire. But once there was that decision in India and Pakistan to pursue that route, that's when the U.S. was not involved. So I think by Jaishankar acknowledging that there were calls from the U.S., I'm not sure if that would be contradicting anything that was said or was not said by the Indian side before. But you're right, there is an inconsistency in the messaging we're hearing from India on this issue. And as I said before, it may be meant to try to find the right tone or the right way of putting out this messaging in ways that would actually resonate with a global audience that has been, not willing to see eye to eye with India on various dimensions of this conflict.
Okay, but just to really settle this, what I've pulled up is the Ministry of External Affairs' readout about that June 18, 35-minute long conversation between Trump and Modi. And it says very clearly here that that at no point during this entire sequence of events when Trump and Modi talked, Modi said that at no point in this entire sequence of events was there any discussion at any level on on an India-US trade deal or any proposal for a mediation by the US between India and Pakistan. While I understand that that's been the Indian position right from the get-go, no carrot or stick on trade by Trump, but that's what Trump keeps on saying. He keeps on like really saying it. He's said it like almost 24 times now. Meanwhile, what's also confusing is the other part of the sentence, or any proposal for a mediation by the US between the India and Pakistan. But that's what Jaishankar is saying, that, they were calling and they were conveying messages that, bro, he's ready to talk, slow down. They're going to attack you. If that's not mediation, what do you call it?
Yeah, I mean, there's several contextual points to make here. One is, as I said before, India is always very sensitive to any type of third-party mediation during its crises. I mean, it does welcome it during actual conflicts, but it doesn't want that broadcast to the world. So I think in that sense, its officials might have an interest in trying to minimize this notion or any possibility of there being a U.S. role. The other thing is that, we know that President Trump will oftentimes say things publicly that are not actually true. And so in that sense, you and I, well, I certainly feel very strongly, based on, my own conversations and all, that the U.S. did not mediate ceasefire talks between India and Pakistan. So going, in terms of the quote you were drawing from that readout of the Modi-Trump call, the long call, I think that this idea, at no time did the U.S. propose mediation talks between India and Pakistan. That might, you could interpret that as saying, well, the U.S. did not propose mediating ceasefire talks between India and Pakistan. So that could be accurate. But I think that at the end of the day, we're not going to know the full story until someone writes a tell-all book.
Yeah,
I don't know if it'll be me, but
I feel like the dark horse in all of this is going to be Rubio, because Rubio who came out with that interesting, very detailed tweet about, like, he even said, oh, they'll be talking in the near future at a neutral venue. He really, that was a lot of TMI. If you know what I mean, at a very, very sensitive point. But we've sort of forgotten, we've lost the forest for the trees on this one, because negotiations, which now the Pakistanis, interestingly, are starting to mention and again. Just in the last 48 hours, former Foreign Minister Bhutto told Al Jazeera that Pakistan may be willing to extradite people like Masood Azhar, or other leaders wanted by other militant leaders in Pakistan, wanted by the Indians, if there is a larger comprehensive dialogue. So, anywho, that's a whole other story, but we've lost the forest for the trees in terms of Rubio's bit about future talks. But let's quickly move on, Mike. Give us a 60-second summary on these two trade deals. The Indians are about to cook theirs. The Pakistanis have cooked theirs. The formal announcement has yet to come, but what are you hearing about the Pakistani side? What are you hearing that the Indians are negotiating for?
Yeah, and just a quick 10-second clarification. Pakistan's position is that Masood Azhar is in Afghanistan. That's what Bilawal said in that Al Jazeera interview, which I think is pretty significant. Anyway,
but he also said that if the Indians help us locate him and give us information, we're happy to help.
Right, exactly. So in terms of the trade deals, I think that it's sort of apples and oranges, and I think that there will be some of those that say, "Oh, hey, look, we got Pakistan got a deal with the U.S. before India did," but these are two very different types of negotiations. As you know, the U.S. trade relationship with India is much larger and more complex than its trade relationship with Pakistan. So in that sense, I don't think the negotiations are that hard. I think any negotiation with the Trump administration would be difficult, just because, these folks in the Trump administration are really tough negotiators. And so in that sense, I suspect that Pakistan might not have needed to make as many concessions as India would. And India has been very public that there are certain no-go areas when it comes to things like dairy and agriculture. There's political reasons there for New Delhi to maintain some protections for those key sectors. But within the Pakistan context, I don't necessarily think that the negotiators in the Pakistani side would have to make as many difficult choices like that, just because there's not as much to the relationship. I'd also argue that the Pakistanis benefit from the fact that there is momentum in U.S.-Pakistan ties now, and we know that U.S. officials are keen to capitalize on critical mineral opportunities, crypto opportunities, some of the C words that you mentioned before. And with India, it's just a bit of a different case. So, Apples and oranges. I still do think there likely will be a US-India deal. Some Indian media have started to report that there will be one before the deadline. And when I say deadline, of course, this coming Wednesday is the day when the pause on the new reciprocal tariffs will end. That's why so many countries want to get a deal before July 9th.
I've also heard an analysis, Mike, one more stab at the Trump factor, the X factor in all of this. I've also heard that it's Trump himself who's sort of like, like goading the Indians with all these claims, and the whole hyphenation thing, which he knows that doesn't go down well in India. And he's even starting to hyphenate Asa Munir with Modi. It's all to get a better deal with the Indians, because for the US, the larger prize, of course, is the Indian economy, not the Pakistani economy, as we know it today, not after those trillions of dollars of deals, which the Pakistanis are promising the Americans. Do you think that Trump is sort of playing a little, hey, I'm going to go to your enemy and court them and maybe try to derive some more benefits out of you than you're expected to give me? You think he's playing this little dance? I can expect him to think in those terms. Do you think that's happening? Because there's some Indian analysis that says that's exactly what's happening.
And I don't know. I mean, it's all speculation. I mean, that might perhaps ascribe too much sophistication to the thought process at play here in the administration. But you're right. I mean, if President Trump is aware of that hyphenation issue, that he would want to try to play that in a certain way to get those types of outcomes. Yeah, absolutely. That could be a possibility. But yeah, I mean, I think as you suggested, the U.S. wants a deal with India. And I would argue there's been some commentary on this in the India press that this administration doesn't actually like India, doesn't want a partnership with it. That's nonsense. It definitely does. Trump genuinely likes India, and he knows, or he's been told, that Indian companies have invested millions of dollars in the U.S. over the last few years. He's been told, I'm sure, that India has significantly increased its oil imports from the U.S. over the last few years, and he wants that to continue, clearly, and he wants there to be less tariffs to make that even easier to do. So I think something will have to give eventually. Now, if it doesn't, and this is the subject of my main column in my brief last week, if for whatever reason there's not a deal between the U.S. and India by July 9th, that I think could be a pretty significant blow to the relationship, just because there are these expectations that it will happen. It'll get the relationship back on track. If you don't get a deal by then, I think that could be a pretty significant thing, and not a positive way for the relationship.
Okay, we've exhausted the trade topic and all the politics that goes with it. Let's wrap this up real quick, Mike. Two other points, important points. One, the Bangladeshis, the new post-Hasina Bangladeshi regime is starting to talk to the Americans. Well, it was talking to the Americans in the previous administration as well, but this one is clearly different. This one is not really interested in upholding democracy, and this one is really more interested in realpolitik and trade benefits. Run us through that also in the brief. And then, sadly, the Afghan human cost in this entire Israel-Iran confrontation. 36,000 Afghans ejected out of Iran in just one day. Obviously, that's a purge which is ongoing. Many of them accused broadly for espionage for Israel. Tell us more about that as well, please.
Yeah, so quickly on the Bangladesh point, I think this call between Rubio and Yunus was useful because, there have been a lot of questions as to what the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship would look like in the Trump era. So I would argue one of the relationships that'll change the most, just because the last few months of the Biden administration, the focus was on development assistance, technical support to help Bangladesh recapture growth and democracy after the Hasina era. But that's not the way that the Trump administration structures its bilateral relationship. So in that sense, the fact that we heard in the call, not to my surprise, in fact, I'd written about this earlier, that trade, economic cooperation will be a big focus of cooperation, as well as this idea of cooperation to strengthen stability in the Indo-Pacific, which from a U.S. perspective is code for countering China. We got that sense that that's how the U.S. wants to structure the relationship with Bangladesh. It'd be a lot easier to do that if there's a deal between the U.S. and Bangladesh to reduce the likelihood that you'll have a tariff snapback. I think it's 29% in Bangladesh. That's big, given its economy has been shaky. Not to mention Bangladesh, like India, is strategically autonomous. It likes to balance its relations with all the different powers, and especially with Sheikh Hasina no longer there, you're not going to see Bangladesh want to privilege its relations with India over those of China. In terms of the Afghan refugee question, yeah, I mean, this is one of these, sort of under the radar issues we don't hear enough about. I mentioned in the brief that this is not a news story. Going back a number of years, we've seen an increasingly difficult environment for Afghan refugees in both Iran and Pakistan, which, as you know, are historically the two top destinations for Afghan refugees. And this sort of occurs in this climate in both Pakistan and Iran, where Afghans face discrimination. They're oftentimes scapegoated for stealing jobs, for being drug sellers, that type of thing. And indeed, now, most recently in Iran, you have had some of these Afghan refugees being accused of spying for Israel, accused by the Iranian government, which, so far as I know, is these accusations are baseless. Yeah, the numbers are really heartbreaking. You mentioned the 36,000 alone on June 26th, and some of the recent data provided by the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, suggested that like more than 200,000 Afghans were sent back from Iran in the month of June. That's a large number. So clearly there's an issue. I mean, this is sort of a story for another day. I think that some of the drivers, the dynamics are different in both Iran and in Pakistan. But I do think that this is, unfortunately, something that is not necessarily going to stop. I don't think you're having significant levels of pushback on very influential levels in either Iran or Pakistan. And the final point I'll note is that the official position from both governments is that it's only illegal, undocumented Afghans that are being sent back. But, in the Pakistan case, I don't know about the Iranian case, but in the Pakistan case, there are indications that some Afghans that are legally in the country are being sent back as well. And, some of these folks have never been in Afghanistan. Some of these folks were born outside of Afghanistan. So it's just a very sensitive, tricky, and ultimately sad state of play.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that the Taliban regime doesn't have very good representation at multilateral forums to defend their case. Mike, thanks for this. I was going to actually talk to you more about recent Pakistani statements, but about the Abraham Accords and potential relations with Israel. But we're going to leave that in our cliffhanger section. There have been moments where the rumor mill in Pakistan has been pretty active. This is one of those moments. At least 3 different government functionaries, Rana Sanaullah, the special advisor to the Prime Minister, Wajahat S, the Minister of Self-Defense, as I like to call him, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Ishaq Dar, Nawaz Sharif's accountant, but also the inside man between the House of Sharifs and the military. All 3 saying within the scope of a week that they are assessing the how and the why, but overall, the situation with Israel remains the same. Pakistan's stated policy is that no positioning with Israel till this two-state solution, but Pakistan will make practical policies. I think we should leave it there. More to develop and talk about on that one when we meet, hopefully next weekend.
Sounds good. Yeah, since this is the cliffhanger section, that suggests I should not respond. So that sounds good. I'll wait till the next discussion. That's an important point that you make, though. That's an important issue to track.
Now that I actually have placed myself on the cliffhanger, I wouldn't mind taking in a quick 30-second take from you.
I mean, as you know, the Abraham Accords were something that the Trump administration brokered during its first term. Very important to President Trump. I would not be surprised if Trump brought up the Abraham Accords during his meeting with Hossein Munir. Final point I'll make on this, I mean, as you say, Pakistan has a very strong position that it's never going to recognize Israel until there's a Palestinian state. But if you look at hypotheticals down the road, if things calm down in the Middle East enough where you have the Saudis agreed to sign on to the Abraham Accords, I think at that point, Pakistan could feel some pressure from the Saudis.
Yeah, well, let's see how it goes. The relationship with the Saudis is obviously critical too. Michael Kugelman, my man in Washington, thank you for doing this. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we will see you at the next one. Mike is at Michael Kugelman on Twitter. He's also the author of the Foreign Policy magazine's South Asia Brief. Comes out every Wednesday, dissected every weekend, right here on Mahaz. Thanks for following him, and thanks for supporting our show. Thanks, Mike. Take it easy. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
That was Mike Kugelman. I'm Wajahat S. Follow Mike. His details are in the description. Follow me. My details are in the subscription too. In fact, if you are interested in following up and reading up more on this, check out my Substack, wajazkhan.substack.com. Just made it to the World News Top 100 rankings on Substack. We're the only daily South Asian newsletter to have gotten that privilege. So check us out. Support independent journalism, support independence. I'll talk to you very soon. Pakistan, Zindabad.